What's up guys, Deroir here and welcome to another episode of Hype Time. This time I simply want to talk about economy with you guys. I know perhaps that's not the most heart-pumping and exhilarating topic to some people, but it is indeed very relevant, especially now with the upcoming expansion. For a long time now, I've been contemplating how I wanted to portray this topic exactly, since I would only have to mention one single item or piece of material from the game for me to probably be called out as trying to manipulate the market. And though I indeed have quite a lot of thoughts regarding that aspect of the market, I guess I'll keep those to myself for the time being, because really I want to talk game economy in more general terms. Also in this regard, I may go over a few details that some of the more veteran players perhaps already know, but nonetheless I hope some of the stuff that I have to say appeals to everyone. Now, as many of you already know, recently the wallet system was changed. This isn't exactly the first time, but I believe this design is more in line with what ArenaNet is trying to accomplish in regards to many aspects of the game experience, but I'll get to that in a bit. Because first off, I want to talk about gems, the lifeblood of this entire game and the single reason why we, the players, don't have a subscription fee and still we get huge updates regularly. Now, as most of you know, gems are of course in and of themselves a currency, but it's a currency that you can only get through two specific ways. Either you exchange your hard-earned gold for it, or you simply whip out your credit card, effectively creating a link between your everyday dollar and a virtual currency. The reason why I mention this is exactly because of this relationship. You see, first of all, any isolated economic system and its inherent currencies, be it in a real world scenario or in the virtual world, will suffer from what is called inflation. In essence, inflation is the word we refer to when describing what exactly happens whenever a specific currency loses its purchasing value over time. In video games, this happens rapidly due to the fact that each time you slay a monster, a certain amount of gold is created from thin air. And so with more gold constantly coming into the economy, the worth of it naturally diminishes over time. This is of course a really simplified description, but for the purpose of this video, we don't exactly need to go through a course of Inflation 101. Now, one important thing to note though is the fact that inflation isn't inherently a bad thing. Sure, it sounds bad to have your coin be worth less, but in reality, inflation can more or less be just a part of any healthily growing economic system. It simply shows that over time there's more money floating around, and more money means higher prices. What's interesting about this virtual inflation that we've got going on in Guild Wars 2 is that it's still heavily linked to real world money through gems. Take, for example, this chart from Guild Wars 2 Spidey, which shows the gem exchange rate over time. This chart is just about the clearest indicator we have that the value of gold has decreased, effectively creating the illusion that your dollar is worth more now than it was a year ago. Now, this is where it gets really interesting in my opinion. The gem exchange system works much like, you know, a bank in real life. In essence, the national bank of any country on planet Earth uses interest rates to affect how much money is floating around in the economy by changing how much it costs to borrow it. Now, instead of cars and houses, well, maybe houses in the future, well, we all get the wonders that the gem store has to offer. Simply put, as more and more players join the game and others get more time on their hands to start farming more gold than they necessarily need, for ArenaNet to keep their inflation rate at a steady percentage, they have to incentivize players to spend their gold in what I normally hear people refer to as a gold sink. As indicated by the previous chart, we see that the gold to gem exchange rate drops occasionally. Lowering the exchange rate incentivizes players to convert their gold into gems before the exchange rate inevitably goes back up. This is just one of the many systems in place to counteract the economy of Guild Wars 2 suffering from what is known as hyperinflation, where way too much gold is created without a proper outlet or worth, which is a horrible scenario for any economy. Early game, ArenaNet had several effective gold sinks in place, such as repair costs and waypoint fees, amongst others, Now, some of those have effectively been retired because in reality, over time, they no longer serve their job since ArenaNet could not let those specific prices be affected by the inflation without punishing brand new players at an extreme level. At a certain point, for new players to enter the game, it would be like throwing a newborn baby into the stock market at Wall Street and expect it to make a living. Instead, over time, the selection on the shelves of the gem store was filled, and with a proper gold sync with inherent incentive in place, ArenaNet could easily remove certain gold syncs from the game. And you've all been wondering why outfits are such a huge deal to ArenaNet, huh? Especially now with little to no content for players to sink their time into, which leaves most players to rethink what and how they play, which in turn leads a lot more players to partake in more lucrative endeavors. Now you may ask, well, why do we still have Waypoint Cost then? That, guys, is perhaps a topic for a whole other discussion, much more related to completely new players than anything else. But in essence, since gold has inflated to the point that it has, and since it still keeps going, to a lot of people, the value of your real-world dollar seems to have increased. Which, as I stated earlier, is just an illusion, but to new players who perhaps have monetary struggles through the beginning of the game, seeing the waypoint cost of 4 silver and debating with yourself whether you should just do the 30-minute walk to that waypoint instead of paying the small fee, spending $10 on 800 gems, which equivalents to about 90 gold, might make the whole experience seem a lot more free. After all, money doesn't buy you happiness, but it can sure as hell buy convenience. But Deroir, what about those of us who've simply boycotted the gem store for good, you may ask? Well, have you ever wondered why ArenaNet added Ascended gear, and on top of that made this final tier of gear in Guild Wars 2 account bound? My guess would be that at some point the economist at ArenaNet, John Smith, must have realized that a larger percentage of the player base did in fact not use the gem store as much as was needed to keep the economy in balance. And so ascended armor, weapons, and trinkets were introduced, which effectively acts as a huge personal money sink, resulting in a mere 5% stat increase. Yeah, funny enough, this is exactly what will happen to the new legendary weapons that will be introduced with Heart of Thorns. Making these highly valued weapons account bound effectively removes insane numbers of material and thus also gold from the economy. Bravo, John Smith. Bravo. Now, as I stated at the beginning of this video, inflation is not inherently bad unless it runs wild, and so even though it may seem like ArenaNet is tricking your gold out of you, now that you know why some of the things are, just know that they have to accommodate for changes, or else Guild Wars 2 would suffer from hyperinflation. That said, let's dig a little deeper into this subject. As I touched on earlier, recently the wallet system was changed to accommodate for some changes that have slowly been added to the game, but hadn't yet been properly placed within the system. Here, I'm referring to map-specific currencies, such as geodes and bandit crests. These, as you may know, function much like dungeon tokens have since the launch of the game. You play a specific piece of content and you're rewarded with the specific currency. Now, dungeon tokens are already properly placed within their own niche corner of the economy, which is a topic on its own that I won't touch on today. Well, these new map currencies work in their own way, in general, and I'm speaking in very general terms here. They can be spent on account-bound gear, tonics, minis, or recipes, the last of which are usually also time-gated. Apart from these immediate rewards, you also have the option of buying keys, which may or may not yield anything valuable, but nonetheless lets you take part in another aspect of the specific map's mechanics. Not only are these new maps incentivizing players to go spend their time there with the promise of achievements and new adventure, they also offer up a somewhat closed currency as a reward for playing on the map. And lastly, many of the monsters that you encounter on these maps while doing the events don't actually drop extra loot either. Genius, to say the least. This in itself limits the flow of newly generated gold into the economy and replaces it with something that seems similar to gold, especially now that it's got its own place in your wallet. Now, I mention this because we know for a fact that the concept of map-wide currency is something ArenaNet is sticking with, and for good reason, I believe. We know that the new maps coming with Heart of Thorns will indeed have their own currency, and I've argued in an earlier episode that we might come to see map currencies in some of the older maps. Now, what would be even more devious would be for future things such as legendaries and or just armor to require several different map currencies. Either way, this system effectively works to counter a possible overflow and still reward players with the things we want. I would at times argue that the rewards we might be able to get with these new currencies may indeed hold more value to the individual player than does anything we can simply buy with common gold. Case in point, Fractals of the Mist. Since fractal relics function much like we know the system from Dry Top or the Silver Wastes, if the rewards for fractal relics were expanded to encompass something like weapons or armor, we might come to value these things a great deal more than most other things in the game. That is, if the price and time invested still accommodates for the expected value. But enough about fractals, the same would of course go for any of these new maps. Now, looking towards Heart of Thorns, for ArenaNet to limit this flow of gold by a certain degree and adding huge rewards to act as gold sinks, the rate of inflation will fall, yes, but only momentarily, which may or may not leave a bigger breathing room for them to hold back on gem store items for a little while after launch. This breather might be enough for them to produce a whole lot more armor and weapon sets for the actual game instead of these easy to make outfits that have to be manufactured often enough to accommodate for the constant and rising influx of gold. But now you may ask, well, if indeed there's going to be so much more stuff in game that'll drain my wallet dry of gold, what do I do? See, there's a number of different ways to counter a potential early loss, and the most obvious one that ArenaNet is probably hoping for is for you to simply buy the gems and convert them to gold once Heart of Thorns goes live. As long as you're spending it on the highest tiers of gear and account bound items in progression in general, you'll only mildly influence the economy negatively unless you're suddenly crafting the old legendaries. Another way of managing this upcoming flux in the economy is of course to simply treat any and all materials, pieces of gear, or loot as the capital stock that it really is. Treating all loot with the same sensitivity as a stockholder would might leave you on the positive end of the spectrum. And that's about all the advice I'll give, so as not to be accused of trying to manipulate the market. The upcoming flux in the economy is something we all, and especially ArenaNet, have to account for. Knowing is half the battle, so I've taken my precautions and invested my fair share in due time. Now tell me guys, what are your biggest economic fears and hopes for Heart of Thorns? Tell me in the comment section down below. Personally, I fear that ArenaNet may simply stick with the greed over need and continue spending production time making more and more outfits or other useless stuff for the gem store. My biggest hope, or should I say interest, is just how new materials will fit in, as well as how some of the less used or hard to get current materials might come to flourish with the expansion. Lastly, as a final note, remember how at the start of this video I said that I'd been wondering about how I wanted to portray this subject? Well, for a time I was actually debating whether or not to make this topic of economy into a mini-series completely separate from Hype Time, since, well, during this video we haven't even touched on half of this gigantic topic. Let me know what you guys think about that idea. Your feedback means a lot to me. But for now, that's all I have for you guys this time. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, I will see you in the mists.